I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Keeping in that vein, if we could probably remain standing for our national anthem under the direction of Dina Madden in treble. Thank you very much to In Treble. Really appreciate you guys being here. That was a wonderful rendition of the national anthem. Before we begin today's program, I would like to take an opportunity to recognize any veterans who are among us or veterans who've served our country either in a foreign war or active duty reserve. So I'd like to just take a moment to give any veteran among us a chance to stand up or be recognized for their service. Thank you very much. Okay, so the reason we're all here together is for the Kemper Memorial Essay Contest. So without any further ado, I did want to introduce our featured speaker talking about the contest theme this year, which was kind of the role of integration and how the military has been an integrative force in American society throughout its history, kind of beginning way back in the Civil War with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, carrying through until World War II and after World War II, and the military we have today. So without any further ado, and with much thanks, Ms. Shannon Turner-Porter is going to talk about that. Thank you.
It's an honor to participate in this program today to honor the men and women who've served their country and who are still serving the country today. I'm a proud mother of a soldier in the U.S. Army today, Sergeant Lamar Williams, a graduate of this high school who is stationed at Fort Lewis in Tacoma, Washington. I have a cousin in his third year at the Naval Academy in Maryland. In addition to these two active young men, several other members of my family, uncles, cousins, husband, brother-in-laws, have served in the armed forces and fought in two major wars, World War II and the Vietnam War. Today, I would like to briefly reflect on the role of the African American in the armed services. The military history of African Americans spanned from the arrival of the first black slaves during the colonial history of the United States to the present day. There has been no war fought by or within the United States in which African Americans did not participate, including the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, the World Wars, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, as well as other minor conflicts. During the Revolutionary War, 5,000 African Americans fought for Americans' freedom. During the Civil War, more than 200,000 black men rallied to preserve the Union and earn their place as free men. In the Indian Wars, 4 regiments of Buffalo soldiers made the frontier safe for settlers. When called upon in the Spanish-American War, black soldiers battled side by side with white soldiers as they took back Cuba's San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. At the start of the Civil War, free Africans immediately tried to enlist in the Union Army. Like many other Africans in America, Frederick Douglass, a free African in the North, saw the Civil War and African participation in it as a way to end enslavement of all Africans. Douglass believed that if Africans distinguished themselves in the Civil War, they would win their freedom. He asked President Lincoln to allow Africans to enlist in the Union Army, and he said, "Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters, U.S., let him get an eagle on his button and a musket on his shoulder, and there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Although they were prevented initially from enlisting in the Union Army as soldiers, African Americans were never prevented from serving in the Union Navy, where they had jobs such as cooks, dishwashers, and launderers. As civilians on board the battleships, Africans defended the ship with such skill and courage that they would eventually break down the barriers preventing them from fighting. But there were still some whites who did not believe that Africans could think or learn modern warfare. Robert Smalls, an enslaved African, proved them wrong. Smalls and his African troops captured a Confederate gunboat, the Planter, in Charleston and sailed it to the Union lines in 1862. He later served as representative in the South Carolina State Legislature. Throughout World War II and the Korean conflict, blacks had to protest at home before they were allowed to defend their country abroad. It was not until after the Vietnam War that they finally tasted the fruits of racial victory, when the armed forces implemented and enforced its equal opportunity plans, providing fair and equal training for all service members. By the time of Desert Storm, black soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines served in every position and every rank, including chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Every African American soldier who fought believed that those who judge Africans on the basis of race and color would learn eventually that all humans are created equal. They believed that their duty in the moment of national crisis was to protect the nation of their birth. 1 million African Americans served in World War II. African Americans went to the war once again against segregation and discrimination in the United States Armed Forces and against the Germans and Japanese on the battlefield. Pearl Harbor, a U.S. territory, was attacked on December 7, 1941 by the Japanese. Dory Miller, an African American cook on board the ship USS Arizona, shot down 4 Japanese planes, although he had not been trained to use the guns due to discrimination. After a lawsuit was threatened, the Air Force finally opened a segregated training facility at Tuskegee, Alabama in 1940 to train African American pilots to fight in the war. By the end of the war in 1945, there were nearly 600 African American pilots, the famous Tuskegee Flyers. On the ground, several fighting units distinguished themselves. Some of the most heroic were the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, the 24th Infantry, and the 92nd Division of the 183rd Combat Engineers. The 761st and the 183rd Combat Engineers were units made up entirely of African Americans who participated in the liberation of prisoners from the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau and Buchenwald in Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion won 391 awards for 183 days of combat, the longest period any unit ever served under constant enemy fire without relief. The 761st knocked out 331 German Marine gun nests occupied by German soldiers and captured a German radio station. The most famous member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. During the 761st training, a white bus driver told Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arrested military police. The post commander transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion. Robinson was acquitted and he was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was acquitted of all charges, After the war, he was instrumental in desegregating professional baseball and would become a fighter for civil rights in America. In October 1944, General George Patton, who had initially disparaged black soldiers, sent a message to the War Department requesting more tankers, the best available. The only tank unit left was Negro, the 761st, the Black Panthers. Who the blank asked for color? Patton shot back in a typically salty style. I asked for tankers. The 761st linked up with Patton's 3rd Army near Nancy, France on October 28th. The front lines lay only a few miles ahead. Suddenly, a bunch of quarter-ton jeeps loaded with MPs and 50 caliber machine guns rolled in and took up strategic defensive position. As the tankers stood at attention, a single jeep and an armored scout car dashed to the head of the formation and stopped next to Colonel Paul Bates. Bates was white, the white officer who commanded black troops during World War II. Everyone knew from the 2 ivory-handled pistols holstered at the man's belt that this was the legendary George Patton, General Patton. The 3 stars on his helmet and collar reflected in the sunlight as he vaulted to the hood of the armored car. Contrary to the movie Patton, it was the black tankers of the 761st that Patton delivered his famous speech. And he said, "Men, you are the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army." He began, "I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill the crowd SOBs. Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things of you. Most of all, your race is looking forward to your success. Don't let them down, and gee damn you, don't let me down. They say it is patriotic to die for your country. Well, let's see how many patriots we can make out of those German SOBs." Patton, of course, was a man to be taken seriously. Although African Americans have been the victims of racial oppression throughout the history of the United States, they have always supported the nation, especially during wartime. African Americans were aware that the war created an opportunity to press U.S. leaders for full citizenship. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the nation's largest black newspapers, stepped to the forefront in the struggle for racial equality by launching its Double V campaign, responding in January 31st, 1942, to a letter to the editor, James Thompson of Wichita, Kansas. He urged the Double V campaign. The paper would publish 2 interlocking Vs with the theme, Democracy, Victory at Home, Victory Abroad, in its February 7th, 1942 edition. The major objective of the campaign was to encourage blacks to support the war effort, but fight for civil rights. Another crucial way that African Americans took advantage of Americans' involvement in World War II to push for civil rights was through mass protests. When Nazi Germany began invading and occupying countries in Europe, American industries began contracting with the government to increase production of ships, tanks, guns, and other items for defense. Despite the urgent need for tens of thousands of skilled workers to help in the production of these items, war production companies refused to hire blacks. Moreover, the federal government refused to take steps to end the racial discriminatory action of these industries. In fact, the administration publicly announced that it would continue to segregate black and whites who enlisted in the armed services. In response to the blatant discrimination on the part of industry and government, civil rights leader and labor organizer A. Philip Randolph launched the March on Washington movement, which helped organize thousands of people of African origin in the United States to march on the nation's capital in 1941, demanding that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issue an executive order banning discrimination in the defense industry. The threat of thousands of black people coming to Washington, D.C. to protest convinced FDR to hold a meeting with Randolph and other march leaders in June 1941. Although the president attempted to convince Randolph to call off the march, Randolph refused unless an executive order was issued. Eventually, FDR agreed that his close ally, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York, and others associated with the White House work out a compromise with Randolph. The compromise was Executive Order 8802, which banned employment discrimination in defense industry and government. FDR also created a temporary Fair Employment Practice Committee to help ensure that defense manufacturers would not practice racial discrimination. Because of a major victory in forcing the government to take action against discrimination, For the first time since Reconstruction, Randolph agreed to call off the march. Randolph and the march organizer had won a major victory for racial equality and had laid the groundwork for the civil rights protests in the 1950s and 60s. The African American soldiers returning home from war sparked a social revolution. So explosive and contagious was the hunger for equality in the 1950s that it seemed at one time there was as many movements for freedom as there were preachers and activists in the African American community. There have been many moral victories won by 1954, the date of the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. There would be no going back. The civil rights movement had begun. Thank you.
Jen always impresses with her speaking style and her great knowledge and expertise. Really much appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's move on to the presentation of our awards. I'm going to call up Miss Mary Cronin, the godmother of the Kemper Memorial Essay Contest.
Thank you, Pete, the godmother. Kemper Park was built after World War II by Adolf Kemper and his family to honor the sacrifice of their son. It also includes the names of 100 other men, actually 99 men and 1 woman who died during the Second World War. The park, which is the granite memorial and all the area around the park, has existed through the hard work and the dedication of a lot of people. The high school, the school district, the towns and the villages have always been grateful that this park has stood there as a tribute to the men and women who died from our community and our school. We are very fortunate in the Kemper Memorial Park Preservation Fund to have so much support from so many quarters. We are embarking on an extensive beautification program. So if I'm knocking at your door looking for a donation, you'll know why that is. We are going to rip up the pathways because they need some work. And we are going to put in new pathways, pavers, a speaking area, and a total beautification of the park so that those who wish to go out into the park and reflect will have a beautiful area in which to do it. This contest means a great deal to me. I know how difficult it is to get young people to write a voluntary essay. When you teach high school, sometimes it is equally difficult to get people to write a mandatory essay. So to expect young people to voluntarily write, and I have to tell you, money is not enough incentive to write an essay. So I was delighted to have, actually I haven't read essays since last June, so I was actually kind of enjoying them because I could read them at my leisure and not have to worry about putting a grade on them. So I'm thrilled. Mr. Green had come up with this wonderful question about the role of the military and how it has always been used as a catalyst to bring about change. And our first young man, Jack, hey Jack. Jack wrote an essay about the role of the African American in the military, and Rebecca took the same essay but wrote about women and how the military has been used to advance the cause of women in this country. And I don't know if you can see from where you're sitting, but that is Marcella's drawing, which I'm sure in the original you could see the colors even better. And I was just blown away that a young woman was able to draw such a beautiful poster. So Marcella, I'm going to give you this check. And you want me to do Jack first? Or Rebecca first?
Yeah, Jack's goes.
Jack's first, okay. my former principal telling me Jack's first. His principal, okay. Jack Mullen, this is the first prize essay, and this is your check.
So this is called Military Integration, a Model of Equality for Our Nation. In 1948, the U.S. military was officially integrated. In a country smitten with Jim Crow, the KKK, and other forces of racism, President Truman defied common thought and made African Americans equal to all others in recognition of their valor during World War II. His decision sent shockwaves throughout the heavily segregated America of the late 1940s. Never before had African Americans truly been equal to white people in any aspect of American society. The U.S. military has been a driving force for racial integration in our society because it has created an expectation for equality among African American veterans and provided a model of racial equality for the rest of America to look up to. One way in which the U.S. military has been a force for integration in our society is by creating an expectation among African Americans that they deserve to be equal to everyone else. Veterans returning from the military left the place of equality to return to discrimination back at home. This stark change created a sense among veterans that something had to be done. 300 of them took action in Atlanta in 1946 when the city wouldn't let the former soldiers become policemen because of discriminatory policies in effect at the time. This caused a protest in front of City Hall where veterans chanted for their rights to be part of the police force. The rally failed, but in 1948, 8 African Americans were hired to be policemen in Atlanta. In addition to protesting, African American veterans took action against white supremacy by fighting back against organizations like the KKK. They did this by protecting prominent civil rights leaders against attacks and resisting the KKK when it used force to try to prevent African Americans from voting. As Webb Du Bois said in his poem, Returning Soldiers, we return from fighting, we return fighting. African Americans were not done fighting oppression once they deflated it abroad. The U.S. military has also been a vehicle for integration by serving as a model for racial equality. One example is the outstanding service of African American pilots as part of the Tuskegee Airmen. Despite that service, in the late 1940s, the U.S. had no part of life where African Americans were truly equal to people of other races. This all changed when Truman integrated the U.S. military and ended all segregation in our defense forces. The Double V campaign jumped at the opportunity to build off of military integration and translate it into everyday life. The proponents of the campaign argued that the U.S. military had finally been integrated, but African Americans were still segregated in their daily lives. This argument gained recognition among prominent African American leaders who looked to the military as a source of inspiration. As Martin Luther King Jr. says in his speech, The Drum Major Instinct, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. King channels the equality of the U.S. military as an example of how all are equally capable of greatness. He is saying that anyone who can protect our nation deserves the right to fulfill their potential and be great. He had the ability to make this claim because he was able to hold up the military as a prime example of equality. Without military integration, King would not have an example of how everyone can be equal in America to preach to his congregation. The military served as a model for societal integration for events like the Double V campaign of the late 1940s, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The U.S. military has been a force for integration by inspiring African Americans of World War II to fight for their rights once they return home, and by serving as a model for integration in our society for Americans to look up to. Truman's decision to integrate the U.S. military inspired millions of African Americans to fight for their equality, ranging from returning veterans to prominent civil rights leaders. One has to wonder what the state of racial equality would be like in America today if Truman hadn't made the revolutionary decision to integrate the U.S. military.
Thank you, Jack. And now Rebecca.
Throughout our nation's history, minorities have had to overcome innumerable obstacles in order to become equals. Several of the attempts to gain equality were challenging and time-consuming, such as the civil rights movement for African Americans. After a long, perilous fight against slavery, then segregation, and finally inequality, blacks have become accepted members of our society. One major event that helped unify blacks in American society was the creation of the African American Infantry Regiment in the military. The United States military has been a major force responsible for granting equality to unique groups because it helps unite different people under one common goal, to protect our country. The military has been a unifying force for abolishing segregation, not just with African Americans, but also with many different types of people. Women are commonly perceived to be weaker, less capable, and more sensitive than men, and therefore too emotional to be involved in warfare. It is because of these stereotypes that women have not been very occupied in wartime affairs. Previously, women have participated with the armed forces solely as nurses, chefs, or caretakers. They were never able to partake in actual combat. For example, during the American Revolution in the late 1700s, most women served as seamstresses, cooks, maids, and nurses, as they were forbidden to take part in the war effort as a soldier. However, in this war for independence, as well as the Civil War, some valiant females decided to disguise themselves as men, cutting off their hair and altering their clothing in order to take part in combat. Since then, women have slowly but surely been making progress regarding their integration into the military. It wasn't until after World War II that women were officially allowed to fight alongside men in the Army. In 1948, the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was passed, which granted females permanent roles in the Army, Navy, and Air Force. 1 year later, the first black woman enlisted in the Army. Since then, the number of women in the military has grown substantially. As of 2013, over 200,000 females are in active duty military positions, and around 70 serve as generals in leading roles. The majority of these women serve in the Army, but a substantial number participate in the Navy and the Air Force, as well as in the Marines. 14 females have received the Silver Star for being in combat. Hundreds are in charge of squadrons and military units, and for the first time in the United States history, as of 2008, a woman was named a 4-star general, one of the most prestigious military honors. Great leaps and bounds have been accomplished for women in the military, and it has completely changed society's view of gender differences. Females can do great things for this country, the same as men when given the chance. Other groups too, such as Asians, African Americans, and Latinos, have benefited due to their increased involvement in the military. The commonality between everyone serving in the Army has provided a basis for equality in American society. They all want to serve our country, and no matter their physical appearance, race, or gender, they should be allowed to do it. Tom Clancy, author of several novels dealing with war, once said, "The U.S. military is us. There is no truer representation of a country than the people that it sends into the field to fight for it. The people who wear our uniform and carry our rifles into combat are our kids, and our job is to support them because they are protecting us." What Clancy said was true. Those in the military are the best representation of America. The only way to truly show the values of our country is for everyone serving in the military to be equal, and that requires equality outside of the Army too.
Okay, so thank you very much to our artists and our essay writers. Really did a great job, really some fantastic work. Thanks again, really appreciate it. So we're going to head out to the Kemper Memorial for the final portion of our ceremony, but first I wanted to say thank you to Dr. Shafts, Ms. Klain, our town supervisor, board member, and all the dignitaries for attending. It is much appreciated. Thank you for supporting this. Thank you very much to Jen Northrup for all of her hard work involved in the Kemper Memorial Preservation Park Fund. I think I got it right this time. Okay, so let's head out to the memorial over on Post Road. Thank you.